These are some more concepts that we need to know in order to rationalize denominators and numerators, which is coming up. So on these, we can add or subtract like radicals. If I had 3x minus 7x, then that would be negative 4x. Here I have 3 radical 5 minus 7 radical 5, so that's negative 4 times the square root of 5. Now, we can only do this when the radicals match exactly, and when they do, then we add the numbers in front called the coefficients. So on this next one, we would add 8 and 7 because they both have the square root of x. So 15 times the square root of x. On the next one, we have a 1 minus 4, and both of them have a radical 3y. So that's negative 3 times the square root of 3y. So you can see that they simplify pretty nicely as long as the radicals are exactly the same. Now, the next one, this one gets a little bit trickier. Notice these are not conjugates, so I actually multiply it all the way. I'm going to take the 3 radical 5 times both terms on the second binomial. So 3 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, right? That is going to be, maybe I should just write this out. So 3 radical 5 times the square root of 5. And then that's going to be plus 3 radical 5 times negative radical 3 plus 2 radical 3. Now I'm going to distribute this. 2 radical 3 times the square root of 5. And then 2 radical 3 times negative square root of 3. All right, so we're going to multiply each one of those. On this first one, that's 3 times 5, right? Because if I take radical 5 times radical 5, it's 5. On the next one, it's going to be, well, I'm multiplying a positive times a negative, minus 3 radical 15. And then the next one's going to be plus 2 radical 15. And then last, I'm going to have negative 2 times 3. So, well, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Negative 2, right, because that's a negative 1 times 2. And then that equals radical 3 times 3 equals 3. So negative 2 times 3 is negative 6. Now I do have some like terms. I have 15 and negative 6. And I have negative 3 and 2. So that would be negative 1 times the square root of 15. Okay, so we're finished with those skills that we needed in order to actually finish this lesson, right? Which is going to be rationalizing, first of all, denominators having 2 terms, and then we'll also do the same with numerators. Now, when we rationalize denominators, we need to know that we're going to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. I had trouble saying that. In order to eliminate the radical that's here, right? This radical y. So it's going to be the square root of y minus 4. And things are disappearing here. Okay. And then that's going to be the square root of y minus 1. Minus 4. Oh, that part disappeared. I was having trouble with some glitchy thing going on there. So it should be the square root of y minus 4 in order to rationalize this denominator. Remember, that is just rationalizing is a way to get rid of the radical that's in our denominator. And then basically we're writing it in an equivalent way, and it just looks different. All right, so we have negative 8 times the square root of y, which is negative 8 radical y. Negative 8 times negative 4 is 32, and it's positive. In my denominator, the square root of y times the square root of y is y. 4 times negative 4 is negative 16, and we are finished. Now, a lot of times students are going to want to try to simplify because they see negative 8 and 32 and 16, and all of those have a common factor, but what about the 1y? See, it doesn't. The only way we could simplify is if we can factor out a common factor in the numerator and denominator in order to eliminate that, but this one does not. Now, I will tell you sometimes on my lab, they will write this in a different way. So I'm going to factor out the negative 8, which leaves me the square root of y minus 4. So they will leave it written this way over the y minus 16. Either way's fine. I normally go ahead and multiply that out and then factor it to see if I can simplify. So it's just a matter of how you write your answer. And either way's correct. On the next one, we're going to multiply by the conjugate of our denominator. Now remember, the conjugate means I switch the sign to the opposite of what it was, but I still have a radical 7 and a 4. It just happens to be a positive 4 now. All right, and so in the numerator, I would distribute the 3. Now you may want to wait and see what happens here. Okay, so if we write this as 3 times the square root of 7 plus 4, then we may be able to simplify, right? Because this is going to be the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is 7. Negative 4 times positive 4 is going to be a negative 16. All right, so I still have the same thing. Whoops. Let me put a parenthesis, radical 7 plus 4. 7 minus 16 is negative 9. So you can see that we will be able to simplify some here. And this negative is going to end up in the numerator. We never leave negatives in the denominator. So basically, I'm going to divide both by negative 3. If I take negative 3 into negative 9, right, negative 3 into negative 9 is going to give me 3. Negative 3 into 3 is going to give me negative 1. So this will be a negative on the outside of that over 3. All right. Or you could distribute the negative 1 and that would also be fine. All right, here's the next one. As you can see, they get a little bit messier as we go. So on this one, the conjugate of my denominator is going to be 2 radical a minus radical b. I like to put parentheses on everything because to me that makes more sense. And remember, we're multiplying by 1, so that means that we have to write that 2 radical a minus radical b over the same thing. Okay, now the denominator is the part where we can take the shortcut, but not in the numerator. So I'm going to multiply 2 radical a times 2 radical a, right? And that's going to leave me a 4a. 2 radical a times negative radical b is going to be minus 2 times the square root of ab. Then I'm going to take the negative 3 and distribute, so it will be negative 6 radical a, and then plus 3 radical b. All right, so you can see that turns out kind of long and messy. And then in my denominator, I'm going to take 2 radical a times 2 radical a. Well, I already know that's 4a. And then radical b times negative radical b is going to be minus b. And the only way I could simplify is if I can factor out a common factor on both numerator and denominator, and I can't. So that means this is it, right? It does not simplify any further. Okay, next. One more of these on rationalizing the denominator, and then we go to the numerators. So I'm going to multiply by the conjugate of my denominator. Now, some of this is just going to be, you know, how can you get this multiplied correctly? So you'll have to just practice that and be careful. And remember that I'm multiplying by 1, so I have to have the same thing in my numerator and denominator. And the opposite sign to my denominator because that's what I'm rationalizing. So I'm going to distribute the 4 radical 5, which gives me 8 times 5, which is 40. And then that's going to be 4 times the square root of 10. and then 2 times the square root of 10. Square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 2. And then in the denominator, I can take my shortcut, right? 2 radical 5 times 2 radical 5, so that's going to be 4 times 5, which is 20, minus 2. Okay. Now I want to simplify and see if I can simplify further. I want to combine like terms. So that will be 42 plus 6 radical 10. And that's 20 minus 2, which is 18. Now, you can see that we're going to have some common factors here. In the numerator, I have a common factor of 6. So I'm going to take a 6 out. And that's going to leave me 7 plus the square root of 10. And 18 is 6 times 3. So there's my common factor, right, of 6. And so my answer is 7 plus the square root of 10 over 3. And that's considered simplified. And remember, you can only simplify if you have a common factor between your numerator and denominator. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video and then we'll pick up rationalizing numerators on the next video. And that will then complete this lesson.